Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and tonight I'm proud to bring you Witchcraft and Theurgy with Brandy Williams. Greetings and welcome, Brandy. How are you tonight?
I'm great, Hercules. Thank you so much for doing the show with me again.
My pleasure. I'll be here in case you need me. And I
Okay.
look forward to your show.
And tonight's guest is Clio Ajana. Clio, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brandy. And Hercules, I'm so glad to be here.
And I know you from our connection with Hercules' show Living Theurgy, and also our connection through Llewellyn Publications, where we are both
Yes.
contributing to an anthology on theurgy, which is awesome.
Yes. And all I could think of this past week are all the changes that I wanted to make. So that's okay.
And so that's kind of my connection with you. And can you take just a moment to let us all know who you are and what sort of what things you do?
Sure. Well, I'm Clio Ajana. I write currently. I am a columnist for the Wild Hunt. So I start the month off generally on Saturdays. That's kind of how we put it. It's like, yeah, start the first weekend of the month. Every now and then it'll wobble. And so I'm under the columnist section for that. I do prison ministry with the Minnesota Sex Offender Program, and I practice Helletic Alexandrian, Witchcraft and Theurgy, and also Baltic Heathenry. Let's see what else. And currently, I am about to do more in depth. It was so nice for the project to come up, writing and exploration. I think you spoke with some things in an email about Selena Fox, and I saw her at the Parliament of World Religions, and she had a public croning ceremony, which was lovely to attend. It was very nice, not for herself, for other people. I know that would be like a lot to say. And how often can you go through it? But it was wonderful. They had a women's section in a red tent, and it was terrific. And right now, my big thing is getting through this next year or two. It's been getting things back into the groove post COVID. That's been the biggest issue. I think a lot of doing the circuit, seeing a lot of places. I appear at Mystic South. I'm going to be at Sacred Space. I was at Sacred Space Between the Worlds in April, and doing that again this next year. So in preparations for that, and just basically trying to see how the world is balancing out. Things have been a little on the itchy side. I think people are itching to get back out and involved and more outdoor event things. So, and yeah.
Oh,
And
you're definitely busy.
well, my most recent one, it was speaking of the Parliament of the World Religions, was actually I was in a production of The Goddess Speaks, and I represented Gaia, and along with 11 other goddesses. And in preparation for that, it was asking each of us, asked our particular deities, any message they had for humanity at this time. Understandably, given the situation with the climate, the literal climate, each one had a lot to say, and Guy in particular had a lot to say. Not quite the "you screwed up, jerks, you might want to reconsider and make your end of time plans now," but pretty close to it, sort of like figure out. And sadly, within the past even month to 2 months, we've had fires, we've had hurricanes, floods, between the situation in Maui and the situation in Juneau. I was just in Juneau in May, and now to see, things that they don't expect are happening. Extraordinary heat, at least where I am right now in the Midwest. We're having heat advisory. Sorry, the heat advisory is tomorrow. The heat warning, where it's like, watch versus warning, that's been here, and they're not used to having 93-degree heat index at 5:30 in the morning. Or as the weatherman said this morning, in Phoenix, sure. In Phoenix,
Right.
that makes sense. In Minnesota, that doesn't quite make sense. And so everyone who's living in a city has it even more, but it's like this huge heat bubble is right over the middle of the country, and just kind of, so yeah. So I am busy with those things, but you're also busy, you know? We're just busy people.
We're busy people. I want to talk to you a little about what Witchcraft and Theurgy is about. We had this conversation actually going into making the anthology, where we were looking for other people to contribute to the anthology. And I said to my colleagues, our colleagues, John Louis DiBiase and Tim Zwicky, Hercules, who's quietly lurking as our producer today, and Bruce McLennan and Patrick Dunn. And they said, well, where are we going to find other people to talk about theurgy? And we were thinking preferably women, like they're all white guys, right? And our editor, Alicia, said, you could do better. And I said, well, we could just ask any witch. And they all said, witchcraft isn't theurgy. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to do a show, Witchcraft and Theurgy, and talk to witches who are also theurgists and talk about what that is. So that's why I'm doing the show. And so I always ask two questions to start with, and then we can talk about anything else. The two questions are, how do you understand witchcraft and how do you understand theurgy? So we can start with witchcraft. So how do you understand witchcraft? What's witchcraft to you?
Well, it's interesting because my background coming to the craft, is, I'm not going to say we all come from something, and some people, if they're very, very fortunate, have been raised in the craft by family and family traditions. I came to it through two other religions. So that, and knowing that, I view it a bit differently. I view it as a connection with the earth, the connection with nature, and the connection with the gods themselves. And all of the tools that we use, whether they are spells, whether they're, do you have the actual physical tools you have? The only difference between someone who is, say, a kitchen witch or a hedge witch, and is what they're calling the tools and how they're using them, to me. And I know not everyone is going to agree with that, and there's this whole thing over it. And I think having come through two other religions to get here, I have a deep appreciation for the connection that you kind of have to make when you are committing to being a witch in witchcraft. And I have great respect for people we're British traditionalists and that's what we do, or people will say, well, no, we just deal with witchcraft, but we don't want to deal with a particular tradition. I welcome everybody. That's me personally, because who am I to say what you believe is wrong, right, or in between? My first introduction was actually in Bryce Canyon National Park. It was 2 years before I would move to the Twin Cities. I was firmly within a different religion, and I had what I would like to call, then at least, was not an out-of-body experience, because I knew I was firmly in my body and it was on my birthday. And I thought, oh, this is kind of nice. And literally someone comes and I'm like, oh, okay. And they make you an offer that I suppose you can refuse, but why? It's like, would you like your life to be X, Y, and Z? And I get this huge vision. I'm like going, oh. And for whatever reason, I knew I heard a voice and I knew it was more than one. And all of a sudden things fell into place without anyone teaching me. And no, I'm not claiming to be a natural witch, but those things where they were in regular society at this time. This is 20 years ago, practically. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah. What would you want in the perfect place where you'd move? Well, what most people want. I want a place that I can afford at a decent rent. I would love to have hardwood floors, because I love hardwood floors. And I wanted a fireplace. And I also wanted to be someplace where it was sunny, because I was living in beautiful Columbus, Ohio, which, if anyone has been there in the winter, it is in a valley, the Ohio Valley. And I didn't have allergies when I moved there. I was starting to have allergies when I left, and I didn't figure out, oh yeah, it's a valley. And I'm thinking, well, partly cloudy, high of 35. I didn't want clouds all winter. It was too depressing. So I asked for sunshine. I should have asked for sunshine and warmth, but I figured it's sunny, it's warm. Needless to say, I got two possibilities. One was Arizona and one was Minnesota. And then all of a sudden I would start to see things like Minnesota license plates, which you don't see too many cars with Minnesota license plates east of Chicago. You don't. There's no need to. And I would start to see more than one, it was not the same car, just showing up. And showing up, I had people who I had no idea had any connection with the state of Minnesota who were like, oh yes, I worked at the Walker, blah, blah, and blah, blah. And someone else said, well, if you can stand the cold, it's okay. I was getting things preparing with my electric socket, and here's what I needed to, which of course is further north, but still applies. And everything was preparing me to go. And when I got here, I had a list of 5 things. I got all 5 things. Now, someone could say it was wishful thinking or prayer, however you want to put it. But that was the start of what would become my introduction. And then I went to Pagan Pride 2004. And
I'm going to stop you and say, going back to your vision, I just have to say, I'm struck by the fact that the goddess gave you Minnesota for your birthday.
Well, yes, and I was in Utah. Ah. And I was in Utah. I was there with my mom. We had, here's the reason I kind of figured it was interesting. We were in Bryce Canyon National Park, and for those who have been there, or if you haven't, it's got the hoodoos. It's very beautiful. You usually don't get to stay in the park. That's like, they generally shuffle you off to some place that's outside. There was a fluke, which I don't think was a fluke, that we ended up for that one night staying in the park because something had happened in the place we were supposed to stay. It got flooded or whatever, something that had broken down, and it was a bathroom flood or something. And so they're like, well, they don't have room for everybody. So they kept us in the lodge, which was beautiful and wonderful. I would not have been there otherwise. And so I don't think it was an accident. I really don't. And that was the start of it for me.
Goddess. I mean, you said you had a vision of the goddess, but you didn't name her. Do you have a name for her, or that you want to share?
Actually, no, it was group. I mean, the voice I actually heard was Hecate, but it was a group, more than one, and was like, okay, she just happened to be the spokesperson, and she became my guide and spokesperson. And when you have what I like to call moving with the gods, they make things very easy, sort of like you do have a choice. But it's almost like, yeah, it'd be kind of easier for it to go this way. So the offer I thought was going to come through from Arizona, it got hung up mysteriously. They misplaced the paperwork, literally. I'm like, how can you misplace something that you said was there? They couldn't explain it. And so I had to make a decision between the 2 areas, and I chose Minnesota. I had a medical issue. The doctor didn't have much to say about Arizona, but it's like, oh, Minnesota, great. They've got Mayo. If anything happens, you'll be fine. So there were different things that came up that kind of sort of was like, oh, okay, I know no one in Minnesota at all. Everyone except my mother thought that I was absolutely crazy for Wine Cup, because everyone's like, it's so cold, which it is, but cold places can keep you warm. And when I got here, what I found was it took a little while, but you actually start to develop some things. And I had no clue that the people I would get along with the best were, of course, the witches, or anybody in the pagan community, to be honest, because I'm a geek. I collect comics. I hang out in stores that were, in fact, one store I now know was a metaphysical store posing as a comic shop. Yeah, I would, I would teach numerology in the back. So they would have comics, they would have metaphysical, and then they have a room, community room, to put stuff in. It was very weird and very small. And I don't even know if that store is still there in Columbus, Ohio, or not. But they had a variety of stores, and the community wasn't like the community I live in now, although I'm sure there were more people once you got into it. And when I got here and found out about, oh, wow, they're these weird, quirky people, except they're not really weird at all. And some of them call themselves witches, and some were like, well, I don't want to label myself. That was the other thing. What if you don't want to label yourself as a witch? And at first it's very confusing. But so for me, my introduction to witchcraft was who do I want to be? What journey do I want to be on? And it's always for me about connection. How am I going to connect with the divine? Is my connection with the divine going to be with one deity, multiple deities? I'm on a pantheistic, polytheistic path. So I went from one to multiple. And that's a huge shift. And what I like to say is witchcraft in of itself is welcoming in so many ways. There are so many different varieties. It's one of the reasons why I dislike the term pagan, because it has a not a bad rap, but if you tell someone I practice a pre-indigenous tradition in European tradition, and someone's like, "Oh, tell me more. This is great." If you say I practice paganism, there's like, ugh. Or I practice witchcraft, then it's, well, which exactly type of witchcraft are you practicing? If they're not a witch, then it gets very confusing very quickly. If they are a witch, then it becomes, well, which flavor are you? And do I like this flavor or not, so to speak? Sorry. It's kind of like that book, Which Witch is Which?
And then
I love that title.
I know. And then I had asked you a question, but you were about to tell the story about going to pagan spirit gathering and connecting with community there.
Yeah, I was at my first. It's funny. The first person I dealt with as a witch was himself. He was a dear friend who was helping me to move from Ohio to Minnesota, and we would have these long conversations that at the time, looking back, I'm like, oh, okay.
Who was himself?
I'm sorry?
You said it was himself, but I don't know the name.
Oh, sorry. A friend of mine, his name is Maya. And
okay.
And I haven't seen him in ages, but he himself is a witch. And so, but again, in terms of traditions, what he didn't say, well, I'm this tradition and this is what I'm teaching you. It was more like, this is what I am, and here's what you can start with. And I get this list, very long list of about 77 books. I'm looking at it going, okay. And I happen to be here for academic research. So, and I had 2 months of free time, which if you give anybody 2 months of time in the summer, and I read very quickly and I love going through stuff. To me, it's like candy, being in a candy store. And then we went to my first metaphysical store, which was Magus Books and Herbs, then in Dinkytown, not far from the University of Minnesota. They've now moved, but they're still in Minneapolis, folks, if you're listening to this. And they're great. And they had herbal classes. That were just getting started. It was their very first year of what was going to be a 3-year program. That, of course, every witch should know something about herbs. So it was going through Materia Medica, and it was going through, basically it was an entire program for herbs. So I was there to go through one program in graduate school, different graduate degree. And then it just so happened every Wednesday night for 1 year, and then each year, every Wednesday night between September and May. And then you have exam stuff in June, makeup if you did in July, August was off, you go back in September. So it really mirrored what the academic year was. So that worked for me. I just had to make sure I didn't have anything on Wednesday nights, which amazingly, I didn't the entire 3 years. And it was a 3-year program, which I really loved. And I learned a lot about just being a witch is more than, oh, you have a spell. I love Charmed, by the way, the old Charmed. I love Charmed, the program. It has its limitations. In fact, ironically, once I started getting into witchcraft, my biggest complaint was, okay, did they have a witch as a consultant, which for witchcraft in the beginning? And why don't we hear more about the religious aspects? It's not wearing skimpy clothing and everyone's a bad guy. I'm sorry. I I see you laughing. And
I know. It's schlocky, but it's a great show, right? So
it is. But what it got me into and realizing was there was an episode that really actually crossed over for me. And it was the episode where it was probably season 4. The reason I know that is because it's Shannon Doherty was out, and then we have this, Rose McGowan was in, and it was when she had to learn all the stuff. And it was the only time I ever saw something, you see him around, with the book and then around doing stuff, but explaining the herbs they were putting in, why it was so important for a spell, and what the meaning of it was. And I wanted more of that. And I wanted to know, for example, when they talked about the goddess, was it a particular goddess? I mean, I wanted to know more details than what they had, but that's because if you're practicing, you want to know. And besides what their fashion styles were, although I love the fashions, don't get me wrong, I like the fashions, but there was a point where I think Paige, the character, had to take a test, and her test was on all of these various herbs and what they meant and how to use them. And that reflected to me that, yeah, this is something that if you're serious about your time in the craft, you're going to get the tools and learn what they are. And it's never stopping to learn. It's all about lifelong learning for me, and making the connection with the gods. That's always important. And also making connection with your community, which sometimes can be a bit controversial. And I see you like you're trying not to.
I have to ask you, how good are you at generating a rhyming couplet like right now? Like that was what they did on the show. They're like off the top.
They did. Everything had to rhyme, and for a while I thought,
why?
Yes, and then I realized, okay, well maybe they're looking at just things where people like to rhyme stuff. Oh, I don't know, several hundred years ago, 500 years in the 1700s, maybe. But no, you
Anyway,
yeah, that
so
was
so that I get very strongly from you about your talking about witchcraft, how important community is to you, and how important
yes,
connection is. Yeah.
because
And
that's what I learned that true witchcraft is. It's not, oh, I don't like you, so I'm going to curse you, or oh, I'm going to do this because, or as my dear, do you swear on the show? I forgot. I don't generally swear, but
Hercules, are you out there? We need you to weigh in. Are we permitted to swear on Witchcraft and Theurgy?
Sure, we don't get a lot of swearing, but occasionally we do.
yeah,
So
I don't. But one of my
go ahead.
one of my earlier trainers said, and we were going hit the skills, and some of the skills we had to learn, of course, were tarot. I already had numerology, I already had astrology, and my thing was, well, why do I need to learn tarot? It's like, well, tarot is a language that every witch will kind of mostly get. You can speak through it. I'm like, okay, fine. And he says, here are the things when someone wants to know about their money life, their love life, who they can screw, and where are they going to get what they're actually going to looking for. So your job, your money, who you're sleeping with, and maybe am I, well, I guess am I going to get married? Am I going to, have kids? All the stuff that's the personal things. And that's what people ask about, because what he and I had in common, although very different, is at one point we've known people who have worked for these hotlines when they were, for the people out there who are like going, what? Yeah, there used to be hotlines. You would call them or go on them, and the goal was to keep someone on very long enough to then give them information. But a lot of people who work those lines were legit. And in the sense that they could give information, but ethically, I think there's always a problem with, should you keep someone on the phone for their money? And that was when really what they wanted to know was in one of those four categories. And it's so hard for me to swear because I just don't do it normally. Sorry. So fill in the blank for the sex thing. Anyway, and that was on there. But for me, finding out, this was 2004, and I attended Pagan Pride, my very first one, and I saw every single possible group in the Twin Cities community, from the OTO, which had a wonderful thing. There was some guy doing something weird with what looked like a record player. There was the Besom Brigade, which was amazing. In fact, I nearly got swept off, literally, out the hallway by a broom because they came through so forcefully. There were labyrinths outside by Reclaiming. They had Elvis was in the labyrinth. That was very interesting. And they had a huge pinwheel to put your dreams on. And I remember the dreams that year, I wrote something in purple. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing because it was to simply go and see and explore what was there. And eventually I came into this huge room that had representatives from various groups. And I spent the entire day from about 10 o'clock in the morning till about 9 o'clock at night in some sort of ritual for different people, different groups, and going through as many different experiences as I could. And that really changed my life towards what I thought witchcraft was. And in fact, I thought everybody in that area was witchcraft. Well, no, the heathens had their own area. They had their own blot using the apple cider, and the OTO had their own ritual space. And you know, but I couldn't put names to any of them because as someone who's new, if you go, it's like landing, well, it's like landing on a different planet, and you kind of can sort of speak a similar language in terms of English, but you have no idea who these people are and what to ask them. And in some ways, that was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to me by far. I always recommend to people, go to Pagan Pride if you have no idea who a witch is, and just observe, just sit and watch, go to as many rituals as possible. If you see someone do something and you're not sure about, just ask them, because if they're there, they're open to being asked questions usually. And the wonderful thing is that if for someone who is interested both in witchcraft and in theurgy, you get to see the connection if you look closely enough at people. And that's what I had the first time. And I was fortunate because I ran to 3 different groups and I kept going back to those 3 groups consistently. So one of them happened to be a University Pagan Society group, which again had different, you had people who were mostly solitaire, and because they were college students, and they had people from the community, but they liked to explore, and they actually brought in representatives from other established groups to come in and say, hey, here's what we do, here's who we are, and you know, would you like to come and visit? The idea being not that they would increase their membership, but so people would know, hey, it's more than just what you see on TV. That was the big thing. And another group was a British traditionalist group that was, it was their outer court, and they kind of mentioned it. And that was when I sort of learned a little bit about gardening, because that's what they were. And another group was the group that I then eventually joined afterwards. And in between, I went to anything that had a ritual attached to it, anywhere in the Twin Cities, if I could get to it. You know, if I didn't have something going on that night, I didn't have work, that's where I was. That's how, for me, I got to see what witchcraft actually was. So I don't think of it as just, hey, you're dressed, you know, like we talked before we started, when people are dressed, there was, I said, well, do you have to have pagan bling? And yes, I said that. Do you have to have pagan bling? And because I ran to some people who were like, it wasn't just, hey, you know, it's like, oh, have something really, really big. Oh, okay. Here, you know, the pentacle you wear around your neck, but here's one that's as big as a belt, literally around like this, that you could wear, that is basically half covering your chest, or having it as a belt or something other else, or tattoos or whatever it is. And people make fun of that now, but I see of it as people who are proud to be who they are. And I love that. I love that people are willing to say, this is what I do, especially in some cases, they may not have a religious family background, or if they do, it's not one that was accepting for them. And this community as a whole, I find, is so accepting of people as they are. There may be squabbles. Every family has squabbles, but even though we are a squabbling family, if push comes to shove, we are going to defend each other or hide things so that people can actually practice. And that's what I really think the core of, if someone says, well, yeah, are you a witch? Well, you can say, well, no, I'm not a witch, I'm so-and-so, but are you prepared to fully explain that? And a lot of times people, you may not have the words to say to people who are outside of the craft or outside of anything that's earth-based in terms of tradition, to explain to your loved ones, well, yes, this is who I am and this is what I do. So in the meantime, you learn the language by being around community with people who will accept you while you're figuring out who you are and what you want to do.
And so
And I don't know
you
if that answered your original question or not.
you landed with a group. You looked at 3 groups, and you said then there was a group that you landed with. Was that the Hellenic group?
Yes. And actually we are Hellenic Alexandrian, which addresses Greek, Roman, and Egyptian. And at the same time, understand, I had spent time with the heathens long before I got involved with Balkan heathenry, which wasn't until about 5 years ago. But I'd spent some time with the heathenry group that was one of the heathenry groups, because there were like 6 or 7 of them, but only one of them was really public. And there were different groups. So if they had a ritual that was a public ritual, I could get there, I would show up, because I wanted to see what things were. And one of the nice things was most of the groups, including the British traditional group, said, hey, we want to make sure you know what you're getting into. So we want you to go to as many different rituals as you can get to. And living in a place like this that has a lot of rituals, if pre-pandemic, there was a ritual pretty much every weekend, every Friday, every Saturday, every Sunday. And if you couldn't find a ritual during the weekend, you weren't looking, because they were just there. But you had to be willing. Sometimes people, it might be a transportation issue, but generally people were very kind and very giving. And so, oh, we're not on the bus route, let us know, we'll find someone who can get you to the ritual. That's what I really loved about the community. They wanted to make sure. When the Sacred Path Center was open, we had that for about 3 years, I think, 3.5 years. And it was in St. Paul, but right on the border with Minneapolis. And I remember that was one of the things we actually kept doing, our public rituals there, not just because it was for the community, but also it was on a bus route, it was convenient, and people could come. And that made it easier for them. So that's one of the other things I got from witchcraft. The biggest other thing I got from witchcraft in terms of my life changed a great deal from that day when my friend helped me move. And then that was in June, and I ended up in Pagan Pride, that was in September. And then within the 3 years after that, I went through an entire witches compendium for herbs and what to do and how to have them, that I incorporated into my own practice, which was great. I also learned about, okay, well, what else matters? Okay, divination matters. Why does divination matter? That's something that we don't often get to talk about. And it's not just, oh, I need this. I actually just incorporated it. It helped with my communication with the gods. With Hecate, we would talk on a regular basis. And my connection with her, just as my connection with Apollo, my first 4, Hecate was one, Apollo, Mercury, and Aphrodite, I think, were the first 4 I had. And it was, okay, when are you going to spend time in conversation? You go into circle. And that was part of my training. I probably would not have gotten to that part so quickly if I hadn't had those other experiences leading up to that. So by the time I got through 3 years, it was like, okay, this is not just something you either see on TV or even something you see at Pagan Pride. This is your life. This is incorporated. This is what you're doing. And that to me was the really important part about being a witch. It also meant that once you cross that threshold, you don't look at things the same way. Even if you wanted to, you can't, I don't know of anyone who's gone back and has been happy. If they truly came to this side of the fence, I don't know if people have gone to the other side, if that makes sense to you, that they've decided, yep, this is what I'm doing, and they've come and they've been called, whether it's the goddess, one god, many gods calls them, they're here. I don't know too many people who have left. I know people who have left because they thought they were unhappy And I actually wrote about that in the Wild Hunt. There's a column I had about maybe 4 years ago about people I knew who had left. And I think you can, the way religion is posted in this country, as somebody told me a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, when they hear witchcraft or they hear paganism, they think it's out there. It's not taken seriously by mainstream because people don't get the whole religious devotion. I feel as though I am religiously devoted and connected with my gods. And that's the crossover with that person who said, oh, witches don't believe in theurgy. Yeah, we do. We really do, but it's not called that. Like until I started learning about it in my training, I would have never thought that those experiences I had as a kid, where I would hear voices, but I was hearing the voices, I knew I was being called. Now, different religion, different characterizations, but it's like, well, yeah, God's calling you. Okay, here I am. Let's have a conversation. There are those people who are open to that and they ride with it and they go through. I just happen to be one of those. That's been my entire life of going through and doing that and being okay with that because of that family background. So even though I don't practice Christianity, have not in, gosh, almost 40 years, more than 40 years actually, because I was one of those smart aleck kind of kids who said, well, I'm questioning why this, and this. And I didn't get an answer because you're a kid. Don't worry about it. You'll figure it out later. And I think those are the kids who might be candidates to go up. When you hear people saying, oh, yes, I knew I was a witch from the time that I read to ride a silver broomstick.
Yeah.
And know it. But the question is that when you're a teen? Is that when maybe you had questions about something and someone decided your questions weren't good enough to answer, or you weren't, good enough to be listened to? If that's the case, that's where I was, except I was not fortunate enough to read that book at that time. I'm not sure it was even out at that time, but when I was that age, I was not fortunate to read that book. So if I had, I probably would have gone into the craft earlier, but that was not what I was doing. So that's a long way to say that I think that witchcraft and theurgy are important. I think they overlap. I think since they're not talked about in context with each other that much, that's why you might not hear people who say, oh, yes, I believe in it. But I believe, and I think that a lot of other people do, they just don't call it that.
Yeah, that brings us to our second question. I only ever need two questions. It really all gets the conversation going. But the second question is, how do you understand theurgy? And I heard you talking about listening to the gods. So I'm thinking that might be where you go.
Yeah, that was actually, I had my first experience when I was between 4 and 6. And on a regular basis, because I was taught as a child, my grandparents, my father's parents, had actually started a church, which is still in existence, still runs. But I was taught that if, God will talk to you. And so I fully believed that, yep. And so I would have these, understanding conversation. Was not my invisible friend. I had one of those too, but that was not it. And it was clearly, it was always at night, and it was always hearing my name and hearing other things being said and going, okay. And I would go wake my parents up or wake up whoever it was, because I honestly thought they were calling me and talking and saying something to me. And since no one said, well, yeah, this is what you should hear, but the idea was you're going to hear this call. No one ever described the call to say it's going to be this and this is what it means. Presumably, I guess, because they figured you would hear when you were older, like teenager or something, as opposed to when you're a little kid. And but that's where I started. When I've always had experiences throughout my life with having conversations with the gods. The one I described in Bryce Canyon National Park it took probably maybe a minute or two, but it was literally your whole life is flashing before you. Like, here's the offer A, offer B. And you're like, oh, okay, great. When I came in and started working with the Gardnerian group, it was, I remember clearly, and I don't understand now, maybe you would, but I remember clearly being told when they saw that I had this list of books and that I'd gone through all these, it was like, well, you know, we don't want to have to worry about deconstruction. And I thought that was an odd, weird thing to say. Yeah, that expression on your face, Brandy. Yes, that is what happened. And there was kind of always a distance. Like, I felt as though it was more, I'm doing this, I'm doing these actions, I'm wearing the robe, I'm wearing the necklace of shells that's, you know, without any breaks or anything else. And here's what I'm doing, and here's a cosmology. But I did not feel connected with the gods. It was nothing like, you're going to sit and we're going to have the lady and we're going to have the Lord and you're going to be talking to them. I'm like, well, why aren't you talking to them? What's wrong with you? That didn't fit. The others with the University Pagan Society group, understandably, because you had so many different people doing different things, there were like 25 people, they were each doing something totally separate. And it was more of a social aspect, which you'd expect. A lot of undergraduates, people from out, and some graduate students. The group that I ended up with, I will say that if I'd gone with the heathenry group at the time, they seemed to be very, very connected. Like, it wasn't just here you do step 1, step 2, step 3, but it was also very research based, which was fine, but I was already doing research. The Hellenists were like, okay, we're experiential. We expect you to do this. We actually have written up pamphlets for if you're going to do the Glorian degree, if you're going to do, which is what we have before you start. If you do the first degree, second degree, so on, it's 13-degree system. If you do those, this is what's expected, and you go through, and you have this packet about this big that you go through, which seems like a lot until you realize much of it is based on your own personal time and experience with the gods. So you keep your magical journal, which I still do. You keep your magical journal, you keep the stuff, and in your magical journal, here's what you have for divination. Your divination where you're practicing your circles. Here's what you have with your connections with the gods, your conversations with the gods, and I took that seriously. So I ended up with a really, really thick binder from when I finally turned my work in to examine, because I was like, okay, every conversation. And the gods were very kind. So I would sit down most mornings and I'd sit before, Hecate would say, and sit before the little altar. We'd sit and we'd have these conversations. And then I would go through, do something else. I'd have something with work. When I had to go and defend my thesis, actually a part of what was in there was what was later published as a Circle of Understanding that actually got published in the anthology that Crystal Blanton was one of the editors. And that was literally what I was doing with putting it in there. It was my first experience saying, well, I need to share what I'm doing, because without my connection with the gods, I would not have this document. And here's what I did. And I wanted to give thanks for that. So I actually wrote a piece on it. And so to me, that is where I was really working with the gods. My biggest connection were things, for example, when I was ill, Hecate makes a wonderful nurse and really good with whiskey. And I'm not a big drinker. So it was one of those things where I had experiences that to this day, if I say it to someone, it's like, well, okay, she was there. I can't explain, but she was there. It was just, I was in the apartment. I wasn't feeling well. She was there. We went through what was needed. Everything else was gone by morning. Now, was it a miraculous healing, or was it that, I just happened on the right things? I will never know. She has been with me in particular every time I've had something medical, including when the second time I went to Bryce Canyon National Park as an adult, I ended up rupturing my ACL because I fell straight down into a pit. And when I did that, when you're out in the middle of Bryce Canyon, and I drove in a car, it was my right knee. So I'd rented a car to drive from Salt Lake City. I got down there. This happened, and fortunately I'd done all the rest of Arizona, all the things Arizona, all the stuff I wanted to see in Eastern Utah. It was like, okay. They give you options of, well, we can get you to the hospital, but someone else got to take the car and everything else. I was by myself. So I ended up being back in my place in the lodge, facing the canyon. And I was there, and I'll never forget when they say, what's a 10? A 10 is when you're in so much pain, you pass out. That's my definition. And she was there with me the entire time. And I remember we talked, we had communication. There were different things that I needed to do, and I did them. And for me, and she actually helped so that I not only came out of that experience stronger and wiser, but I also felt as though I had a much deeper connection. And this has happened every year. And I'm using her as an example because I've had connections with other deities where something has happened, and I enjoyed that. And for me, the essence of theurgy is, how am I deepening that connection with the gods? How are they not just manifesting in my life for me personally, but also in what I do for other people? And can other people, can I help them see that the gods are everywhere, all around us, and they're there? Because I'm just going to say this. Some people will say, well, yes, the gods, blah, blah, and archetypes. And I'm not a big archetype person. I never have been. Yeah, you can laugh. Go ahead. It's all right.
No, I really totally, everyone's so in love with Jung. They're like, the gods are not archetypes. The gods are not figments of our imagination. The gods are real, but that's the line I fall on.
Yes. And when I was actually at the Parliament of the World Religions, and this guy was like, oh, I'll help you get through. And he said, well, he heard what I was working on. Oh, and so what about the archetypes? And I'm like, no. They are as real as I'm talking to you now. And he kind of suddenly disappeared. He did not like that answer. I think people fall, and granted, he was not a pagan, he was not a witch, but I think people fall on the line of, you have the soft polytheist and you have the hard polytheist. And I'm a hard polytheist. And I realized after all these years, that's probably where I was meant to be, because I can never see and say, well, yes, you're a god I worship. And by the way, you're an archetype. No, that never made sense to me. Even as a kid, I just didn't know how to put it in words until I came to the side of the fence.
And so I saw Hercules waving at us. Hercules, we're at the hour. Did you need us to wrap it up?
I have maybe another 10 minutes I can give this.
Okay, I'm so sorry because we started later. Okay.
Like it is.
Yeah, no worries. I'll tell you a fast Tony Merzwicki story. So Tony and I were sitting on a panel, and someone asked a question about psychology and magic, and I gave this kind of answer like, I totally validate whatever it is that you believe the gods are. And Tony looked at me and said, but Brandy, you do believe in the gods, don't you? And I said, yes, Tony, I do. And so now I'm on record.
What a great guy. Were you not on record before?
I like to validate whatever people believe, right? And so, if Jung speaks to you and the archetypes speak to you, absolutely, you should go in that direction. For myself, I see, the gods is real. And I want to, but I don't want to talk so much about me. I want to get to, if we have just a few more minutes, you've been talking about seeing an overlap between witchcraft and theurgy. You said you walked into Pagan Pride and you could see in the room that there were connections between people who think about witchcraft and people who think about theurgy. So can you talk a little bit about how you see those connections?
Sure. At the time, I didn't have words for it. All I knew was that there were some people who were, they were doing things, and they would mention, and just someone would say, oh, hail Hecate, okay, fine, and that she's there, and here's what she's doing. I'm like, okay, but I didn't know, because at that point, I did not have names for the various deities. I think the connection overlap is if you are someone who sees everything in archetypes, and that's your thing, because that's as far as you can go in your belief system. At some point, if you are on the theurgy side of the fence, how do you get that connection, that divine connection? And I, one of my earliest, my first column for the Wild Hunt was about the P word, prayer. And I think that prayer, a lot of times people don't associate that with witchcraft or with anything under earth tradition. And yet, yes, if I believe if you are a witch, you pray. I think if you're a theurgist, you've got prayer. How you call it, whether you might not call it prayer, you might call it something else, but it's that connection with the gods that you're having, that you are choosing. And however you're choosing that connection, whatever it is to call it, there has to be something in common so other people understand, oh yeah, this is what you're doing. It's not just people who are a part of what I call the big three, Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, who get to play and say, well, yes, prayer is important to us, or, you know, we're having it. We at Pagan Pride, I see people who are very into what I would become, actually having that connection and speaking openly of it, and actually using that as a way to engage and learn about what the craft really is. So it's not just, okay, we talked about Charmed earlier. Yes, you've got people going around, and if someone's wearing their witchy bling, which I think, hey, support your artist, you need to. Are you going to separate that from the devotion that person probably feels in their heart and in their soul? I don't think you should. And I think that it's not recognizing that there is a boundary that is often crossed by people who are seriously devoted in earth traditions, that it comes out as pagan pride. And then they'll say, okay, I'm going to ritual, I'm having this working with this god or these gods, and I'm going to do something as simple as, for example, with the pinwheel, which I, at the time, I'm like, oh, I see that every time and I love it. Writing down something as simple as, here is my wish, here's what I'd like, and putting it out there. You don't see that as a connection, but it can be. The only thing is people don't talk about it. They talk about the one side. So if you are well, yes, here I need to purchase an athame, here I need to purchase some incense, okay? What about, what is the connection you have with whatever deity? That may come back later, that may not come back. So the overlap I see at Pagan Pride or any pagan event gathering are the people who then express who they are, what they do, and other people say, oh, well, I do that too. They just don't think of that as being a part of witchcraft. So I think it's a labeling issue. And also, I remember early on, it was mentioned to me, and maybe you both have had this too, of people who actually think that being a witch means you are running away from, quote, organized religion. And I think, to be honest, if you're doing anything like this, any religion period, you need to be organized. Even if you are solitary, you are organized. Even if you have to declare, okay, here's when I'm celebrating the moon. Okay, Mercury retrograde was today at 2:59 p.m. Central Time, which it was. And so here's what I'm doing to make sure things are done before Mercury retrograde. Or here's what I'm doing to celebrate full moon, dark moon, Sabbath, if that's what you're having. How many Sabbaths do you have? When are you going to put them? That takes organization and patterns. So I think if you're going to choose this path, you are not running from organized religion. You are actually embracing and having an organization for yourself. But I don't hear that often, and I don't say that very often. But I will say that to you, my friends, because it's just the three of us or two of us and however many millions of people out there.
Are watching the video. Thank you so much, Clio. It's been wonderful to talk to you. And before you go, can you tell people how they can connect with you? Where can we find you online?
Sure. You can find me online at fastest way is actually through the Wild Hunt, wildhunt.org. And you can click on, I'm under perspectives and then columnists, and click on my name, and that'll get an email to me that way. You can DM me or private message me on Facebook. I'm getting together with Instagram, but it's getting a little slow. And you can also email me at clio@clioajana.com. And any of those work fine. I love to hear from people, and and of course with you guys whenever we meet.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hercules, for hosting us again. It's been fantastic.
Thank you for me as well. I learned a lot. One day we have to have a conversation about archetypes. Part of my background is I was a therapist for many years. So
Oh my gosh.
I have no problem with viewing the world in several different ways. And like Brandy, I kind of agree with people. Whatever they're experiencing is fine with me. So that's pretty much where I stand. I just want to close by saying one thing. There are many points where I wanted to jump to the conversation so badly, but I also had a business where we sold comic books and action figures and fantasy horror and science fiction books. And we had a room in the back where I used to give my talks. And that room had tons of like occult books, in it. They were hard to find. Somebody made a YouTube video about visiting my shop. So anyway, thank you both. This was wonderful. I'm glad, Brandy, that you came up with this idea. It's a phenomenal idea. And thank you, Clio, for gracing us with your presence and sharing the contents of your mind. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot.
Thank you. And I love being here. Thank you so much, Brandy. I'm so grateful for being invited. Thank you. And thank you, Hercules, for producing.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Until we talk again.
Evening. And now I usually fumble for the button for a little while. Let's see how long it takes.
Okay, because you've recorded this whole thing. You're still recording.
I'm still recording, yes.